Welcome to another in the London Luminaries lecture series. The London Luminaries is a group of 15 historic properties working together to explore the history of the West of London. And this is one of our talks on the theme of love and death. Do check our new website where you'll find details of the rest of our series and also recordings of previous talks. My name is Judith Hawley and I'm your chair for this evening. I thank you for watching and also thank all those behind the scenes who helped to make these events possible. Ricky, Chris, Robert, Angela, and Rachel, among others. Let me now introduce our speaker. Our speaker is Angela Platt, who is a lecturer in liberal arts and a course lead in English literature at St Mary's University, Twickenham. She's a cultural historian whose research expertise focuses on the emotions, especially love and related emotions, gender and family, and history and cultures of religion. She has published on love in a Baptist community, pain in the Atonement era, and has a forthcoming chapter on love and the divine. Over to you, Angela.
Thank you, Judith. Yes, I'm delighted to be here with you all tonight. And indeed, I'm going to be talking about Boston Manor House, love in a modern household, as you can see it displayed on the screen here. And what I'm going to be talking about is, in effect, kind of a long 19th century view, sort of a little bit further than that even, looking at kind of conceptions of love, narratives of love, and the experience of love of the Clitherow family who lived in or owned Boston Manor House from 1670 until 1923, when it was sold onwards. And so what I'm going to be doing is talking about love through various guises, various forms, through its connection to community, to religion, to various objects, kind of using this Clitherow family, who, as I said, they owned, either living in or renting out this property from 1670 to 1923. So to start with, in 1670, James Clitherow, who was born in 1618, he was an active merchant and banker. He purchased Boston Manor in New Brentford from John Goldsmith. So James was the son of Sir Christopher Clitherow, who was the Lord Mayor of London from 1635. And as I said in my opening, this manor then stayed in the Clitherow family from when he purchased it in 1670 until it was sold to Brentford Council in 1923, and it was sold by John Bouchier Stracey Clitherow in 1923. So I'm going to be talking, as I said, about this family, and they owned Boston Manor household from this whole period. And what I'm going to be doing, I will talk a little bit about how the manor passed through various members of the Clitherow family, but then I'm going to identify 3 case studies from the Clitherow family and look at how love was experienced, kind of valued and conceptualized in these particular case studies. So this Clitherow family, they owned, resided in, rented, and maintained Boston Manor House from 1670 to 1923, as I said. So the Boston Manor House, you might see that as being kind of this axis point, which provides a thread of history for this family, for the lived experience of this family. And through this family, I want to talk about kind of and chart various ideas of love. So the manor almost serves as something of a living memory of love in the Clitherow family. At least I'm using it as sort of the springboard to talk about the Clitherow family and love. I'm drawing from archives from the London Metropolitan Archive, and I'll detail, as I said, kind of 3 case studies in the main, which are giving kind of accounts of how love might be conceptualized or experienced. So love was then demonstrated through the life cycle, as noted through the care of Boston Manor property, as family members such as James Clitherow I, the one who purchased it in 1670, and his immediate successors sought to preserve a valuable inheritance for their descendants. Love was also demonstrated through remembering Colonel James Clitherow, and he died in 1841. And although he had no children, and I'll bring him up again because he'll be one of my case studies. So Colonel James Clitherow died in 1841, had no children, so didn't have any descendants to whom he could directly pass Boston Manor household. And yet he was noted for making a really valuable, loving impact on his Brentford community. Love was also demonstrated through the Reverend William James Stracey Clitherow in the late 19th century, who upon retiring from his vicarage of more than 30 years in 1888, wrote a heartfelt letter to his parishioners on New Year's Eve of 1888 and was honored with gifts from his beloved congregation. Love was demonstrated through letters and gifts exchanged between John Bourchier-Stracey's stepson. John Bourchier-Stracey is the one who sells Boston Manor House to Brentford Council. He had a stepson named Thomas, and Thomas's mother, or John Bourchier-Stracey's wife, Alice. Thomas and Alice were exchanging letters while Thomas was laboring in the trenches in the First World War. So through these many kind of sources and stories of love in the London Metropolitan Archives about this family, the love of this family can be traced through many types and rooted in numerous sources. As I've already noted, the objects left behind serve as a public memory of their love and offer insight into the cultural understandings of love during this time, particularly in what I'm calling kind of the long 19th century. So most of the case studies, the detailed case studies I'll be going into, go from early 19th century to early 20th century, the First World War. So in this presentation, I want to explore love through various types and objects. I'll explore religious love, which can be viewed actually as a prevalent theme across exchanges in this entire long 19th century, but especially in the correspondence of Reverend William James Stracey, whom I've already mentioned, the funeral of Colonel James Clitherow, whom I've already mentioned. A social or communal love is also relatedly observed through the exchange of these men in their church communities, but also through the military community, described by the documents of John Bourchier-Stracey Clitherow and his son Thomas. Familial, especially maternal love, is noted in the exchanges between Thomas and his mother as he expresses the desire to return home from the trenches in the First World War. So the documents in which this love can be identified offer insights into the spaces and materiality of love, the experience of love in the everyday for these people. Homemaking and longing for home are central to discussions between family members such as Thomas and Alice, whom I'll go into more later. The objects which preserve the life of this family, and many of them kept within Boston Manor House as a home, these are objects of love, preserving the living memory of these individuals. Letters exchanged, gifts of undergarments, shelves, and boots all demonstrate love and preserve the memory of loved ones in their tangible materiality. So, at the time of its purchase in 1670, and you can see an article of sale here from its purchase by James Clitherow in 1670. At the time of its purchase, the house had undergone extensive repairs after the damage it had suffered previously by fire. So James Clitherow purchased it in 1670. He died in 1682, and Boston Manor was left to his son Christopher by his third wife. Christopher was only 16 years old when he inherited Boston Manor household. He held on to the house and acquired additional property in Middlesex, which was used for rents. And this becomes a common theme in this mercantile family, the Clitherow family, the purchasing of properties and indeed renting them out. Boston Manor becomes one of those properties as well. In 1689, Christopher married a Rachel Paul, who bore him 15 children before she died in 1714. And if we look more deeply into some of the archives at London Metropolitan Archive, you can see that the size of his family was the subject of much anxiety, as noted by his expenditure records and his urgency to establish his younger sons as merchants in the city of London. So Christopher, the second owner, died in 1727, and Boston Manor was left to his eldest son, James Clitherow II, who had recently completed his education at Oxford. James II married Philippa Gale, whom also inherited a number of sizable properties from her father in Sussex, sort of adding to the family portfolio of properties which they could kind of make money from. In 1752, James Clitherow II died, and Boston Manor was left to his eldest son, another James Clitherow III, pictured here. He was only 22 years old when he inherited the household, and like those before him, he kept a careful account of his finances, owing to inheritance left by other family members, including Boston Manor House. He was known as shrewd and developed a sound reputation as a trusted merchant, and he was much used by relatives and friends to advise in financial affairs. Again, a mark of the Clitherow family, their shrewdness in financial affairs. Upon his death in 1805, Boston Manor was inherited by his only son, Colonel James Clitherow IV, whom you can see pictured here. And he is going to be the subject of one of my case studies that I'm going to look at. So I've already mentioned him briefly in the intro. Colonel James Clitherow was a renowned philanthropist in Middlesex. He worked as a justice of the peace, chairman of the committee responsible for the first county lunatic asylum, and many other duties, which are documented in his funeral service. Although he did marry, when he died in 1841, he didn't have any children. So his funeral service actually demonstrates a different kind of love, not a familial love in kind of the traditional begetting of children sense, but the love of his community that I'll talk about a bit more later. He had demonstrated much reciprocal love for his community. He was heavily involved in philanthropic efforts, which I'll detail later. When he died, Boston Manor was briefly left to his wife. So he died in 1841, went to his wife, then she died in 1847, and Boston Manor passed on to his cousin, General John Clitherow, very briefly again, and then the manor was left to the general's son, John Christie Clitherow, who then died in 1865 with no children. And there's not much in the archives about General John Clitherow or John Christie Clitherow, at least not at the LMA. So at this point, the manor swapped to Colonel Edwards John Stracey, the elder son of Emma Elizabeth Clitherow, the daughter of Christopher Clitherow, the second Clitherow to inherit the property. Emma married John Stracey of Norfolk, and upon its inheritance, Colonel Edwards John Stracey adopted the name and the arms of the Clitherow family, as this was part of the terms of Colonel James Clitherow's will. And you see this with subsequent family members who inherit Boston Manor household as well. They adopt the Clitherow family name. So from that point onwards, Edwards John Stracey was Edwards John Stracey Clitherow. A rental book covering the period from 1865 to 75 indicates that the manor may have been used by renters during the period of Colonel Edwards' ownership. Upon his death, the manor was then inherited by Reverend William James Stracey Clitherow, another one of my case studies that I'm going to go into, whom I mentioned earlier. So Reverend William James Stracey Clitherow, he was nearly 80 years old when he inherited the property. And in the same year, actually, he retired his ministerial role, his vicarage role, that he had held for over 30 years, and he moved to Portland Place in London. He and his wife were much loved by the congregation of his parish when he retired after 30 plus years. And I'll go into that further as one of my case studies, noting the letters, presentations, and gifts which they lavished upon him on his retirement at 80 years of age. Boston Manor ostensibly continued to be rented out to tenants and was passed on to John Bourchier Stracey Clitherow in 1912. He's the final Clitherow owner of Boston Manor household before it's sold to Brentford Urban District Council. And John Stracey Clitherow's is sort of one of the case studies as well. I'm going to be talking about his wife's son, Thomas Gurney, whom I mentioned earlier, because his wife's son, Thomas, exchanged letters with his mother, Alice, during the First World War. But also, briefly, I'll mention John Bourchier Stracey because there are letters and ephemeral documents in the archive which relay his experience as a military leader, which he balanced with renting out Boston Manor House, which, if we had time to dive a bit deeper as well into some of the kind of rental discussion, you'll see that he gave a lot of care and concern about the preservation of Boston Manor household. And as I noted, in 1923, the estate was sold by John Bourchier Stracey Clitherow to Brentford Urban District Council. So as I said, I'm going to focus on love in the Clitherow family. And to do that, I'm looking at kind of almost four case studies. And I'm going to be talking about how kind of love is conceptualized, understood, exemplified in the experience of these different family members. But before I get to that, let me talk to you a little bit about what love is. And I'm sure you've had much ample opportunity to discuss love and to discuss death, of course, in previous sessions. Let me tell you a little bit about kind of my foundational kind of research-based understanding of love and how that is exemplified through the Clitherow family. I mean, I have a few definitions of kind of different ideas and philosophies about love in history, as you can see on the screen. The most significant of the ones that I'm displaying is the fourth bullet point, actually. Christianity, kind of religious love, is going to feature very heavily in this research. It's noted in all of the family members, the Clitherow family members I'm looking at, and it is as well, kind of perhaps in a biased way, one of my subjects of expertise. So that might be why I'm also potentially focusing on it. But arguably, Christianity did first introduce the idea that love was an emotional target, which was necessarily part of the family experience. The purpose of marriage was generally social, to procreate and rear children, rather than being explicitly emotional. But Christianity, some have suggested, was the first to suggest that kind of love should be imbued into these familial relationships in an emotional type of way. And I'm going to say a little bit more about kind of the modern context of that very shortly. I mean, importantly as well, what a lot of historians of love, like myself, would say is the final bullet point too. And this is going to come up in what I'm going to talk about regarding the Clitherow family. Love is typically understood as something which is not a fixed category. It's not something that is necessarily the same in all times, in all families, in all communities, and amongst all individuals. There is often an understanding that love has variance depending on kind of subjective experience of different individuals in different times. Love, and in this paper, and looking at the Clitherow families in this presentation rather, I discuss how love constructs what I will call narrative identity. And I'm actually stealing this from a psychologist named Dan McAdams, who talks about how human identity is constructed through the stories that we tell ourselves. And this sort of overlaps with my literature interests as well, I think. Dan McAdams says that kind of individual identity, who we are and how we see ourselves in the world, is akin to this personal myth that we construct, the stories that we tell ourselves. And through these stories, individuals kind of reimagine their past, their present, and their future. And I'm going to home in on various stories within the Clitherow family to try to understand what stories of love they are telling themselves and how that contributes to their understanding of themselves and the world around them as well. And these narrative identities, so-called, these stories that people are telling themselves, they do take place within particular communities. And there have been scholars who emphasize this. If you're interested, historian Barbara Rosenwein is one of them, who says that all emotions take place within emotional communities, including love, but other emotions as well. And so whilst kind of the experience of emotions might be universal in that everybody to some extent experiences emotions, the minutia of these emotions is located within particular communities. The community that I'm focusing on here is that of the Clitherow family. It's kind of a dual community, the Clitherow family and kind of Brentford, Boston, the area of Boston Manor household more broadly, but especially the Clitherow family. And I'll talk a little bit more about communities very shortly. It has also been said, the third bullet point, that love is a form of ontological rootedness, which is a somewhat kind of academically verbose way of saying love is feeling at home. Love is feeling at home. And the space of home, the significance of home, not just kind of Boston Manor household, which is the centerpiece of this talk, the catalyst for this talk, but the idea of home and its link to relationships becomes quite significant to the Clitherow family. And the final thing I want to say about love before I move on is the importance of duty in love, to ensure that it becomes something really important within kind of the modern world, I suppose I'll call it. Certainly by the late 18th, early 19th century, an important emphasis on trying to inculcate feelings of love in the beloved, in those whom are loved, kind of within the family, in a romantic context, or within a community. And duty is quite central to this. And so kind of thinking more broadly again about kind of what historians have said, I suppose, there has been an argument put forward that by the 18th century, you see this kind of new sentimentalized view of love. Up until that point, it is argued, kind of families and communities tended to emphasize more kind of economy or duty. And by the late 18th and early 19th centuries, you see this sentimentalized view of love where feeling is starting to matter. That's been challenged a lot. And I'm agreeing with that challenge with the caveat. And what I would say, and you can see this exemplified, I think, in the Clitherow family, is that by the early 19th century, you do see the emphasis on feelings certainly being, you see a greater emphasis on feelings of love, but duty is still important. And if anything, kind of becomes something of a duty to try to inculcate those feelings of love, the feelings of feeling at home in those whom are loved. But I'll say more about that as well later. So how are these duties manifested? And this is going to be really important for a couple of the case studies. These duties of love are manifested through charity, through philanthropy, through letter writing, and through gift giving. So love is identified within various communities and perpetuated, or perhaps even activated, you might say, by the fulfillment of various duties. And in this presentation, I'm looking at how love is represented, I'm looking at how it contributes to people's personal identities, the stories that they tell themselves. I'm looking at how it's represented in the Clitherow family as a community, but also sometimes in kind of the Brentford community as well. And I'm going to talk to you about kind of different concepts, conceptions, different objects of love through the Clitherow family. So I'm putting on the slide my overview, but I'm mindful that I'm about 20 minutes in, so it's not quite an overview at this point. It's more telling you what's to come. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at religious love, and I'm going to focus on Reverend William James Stracey's resignation from the vicarage in 1880 and how that exemplifies love. James Clitherow's funeral in 1841 and how that exemplifies some aspects of religious love. I'll look at rituals of love within communities, such as, again, back to Stracey, he comes up a lot in this talk, his parish community and the importance of that religious community of love. I'll look at John Bouchier Stracey Clitherow briefly, and kind of the military fraternity, the brotherhood of love, particularly in wartime. Then I'll look at love and objects. I'll talk about the letters and gifts exchanged between Stracey and his parish. There's the Reverend again coming up. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I'll talk about letters and gifts exchanged between Thomas Gurney, so that's the stepson of John Bouchier Stracey Clitherow. So I'll look at letters and gifts between Thomas Gurney and his mother, Alice, during the First World War. So let's start with religious love then. So religion is a crucial component of love to many members of the Clitherow family. And as far as I can see in the research I've been able to conduct thus far, all of the members of the Clitherow family seem to consider religion as a really important part of their community and identity. So Colonel James Clitherow, I showed his picture earlier. I'm going to picture him again. He died in 1841. And he had inherited Boston Manor in 1805. I've already noted this, but just to remind you, although he had married, he had not borne any children. And so the estate of Boston Manor briefly passed to his wife and then to his cousin, General John Clitherow. Despite not having children, though, Colonel James Clitherow did leave a legacy of love, which was remembered in his funeral service, owing to his engagement with the community and his philanthropic work and his religious piety as well. His eulogy describes the loss of Colonel James from the county of Middlesex as the loss of a friend for the parish and neighborhood. He was described in this funeral service as a friend of no ordinary description. And the attendees at his service were implored by the eulogist to consider the following. They said, what person, what family in this place or in its immediate neighborhood has not at one time or other experienced the advantage of his kind advice, his personal friendship, or his public services? The colonel's involvement within his community was multifaceted and huge, significant. He worked effortlessly to inaugurate the first lunatic asylum at Hanwell, and he actually worked as its chaplain for many years. He held numerous civic offices in Brentford, among them including the Justice of the Peace. He was the governor of Bethlehem Hospital and VP of the Royal Humane Society. His work amongst the poor and needy was described as one of the highest pleasures of his life. His concern for his community and neighborhood was, for those who were speaking at his funeral, rooted in his religion, they said. The colonel was praised for his pious example that he left behind, as he was described as a man of piety with unshaken and unimpaired faith, as those in his funeral service note. They said religion was with him not a matter of idle ceremony or speculation, not a spirit of party or controversy, but the steady, quiet devotion of the heart and life to God. For the community of Brentford, Colonel James was lauded as an example of a loving kind of religious life marked by fulfillment of numerous duties which were rooted in his religion. So love was this religious enterprise which was exemplified or manifested through the numerous duties that he fulfilled. So that was Colonel James Clitherow. You also see the importance of religious love through Reverend William James Strachey. Indeed, religious language is used to describe his impact nearly half a century later. Just a reminder again, Reverend William James Strachey Clitherow, adopting the surname Clitherow as well. He inherited the manor in 1888 when he was 80 years old. And again, as a reminder, at the end of 1888, on New Year's Eve, exactly actually, William James Strachey Clitherow offered his resignation to his parishioners as he resigned from the diocese, from the vicarage. And this is the same year that he, as I said, inherited Boston Manor House. He wrote them a letter, which was published on New Year's Eve in 1888, published in the diocesan magazine, outlining his inability to fulfill his parish duties, he noted, because of his age. He argued that God had been pleased to deprive him of all active powers of life and usefulness in my limbs, for which reason he decided to withdraw his position and make room for what he said, make room for one more able, younger, and better than myself to occupy my place. This decision was not easy for Reverend William James Strachey Clitherow because of love, which he notes in his letter. He says to his congregation, I need not tell you what pain this decision causes me, how I dread the day. You will understand that, for I have lived among you more than half my life. So difficult was the decision that Strachey decided not to preach a farewell sermon, which was very customary of that time. Unless you left under kind of untoward circumstances, ministers would usually preach a farewell sermon. Why couldn't he do this? He said that he was concerned he would be unable to maintain his composure given the strength of his love for his congregants. He said, and this is published in the parish magazine as well, because he issued a response, kind of a follow-up when his parishioners wrote to him after he resigned. He said, I could not, I know, preach what is called a farewell sermon. I should break down in doing so. So I must take leave of you in this letter. I am sure you will believe in the sincerity of my love for this parish and many in it. And just a brief caveat here as well. I mean, I'm not going into it in this presentation, but this is a really interesting excerpt here, an interesting quote by the Reverend in 1888. And if I had more time or a different topic, I might talk a little bit more about how the Reverend's focus, or I suppose revealing of inward feeling, is quite significant in exemplifying a portrayal of a particular type of Christian masculinity in the late 19th century. So that's actually a really interesting quote from the parish magazine by the Reverend for many reasons, besides the one I'm looking into, besides kind of looking at love as I'm doing right now. So echoing the memory of the colonel, love was intimately connected to practice for these Clitherow family members. And this echoes research in the long 19th century, where historians and other scholars have argued that love was increasingly sentimentalized As I noted earlier, I sort of hinted at kind of some of the debates that are going on, suggesting that love is becoming more sentimentalized by the late 19th century because of the cult of sensibility in the 18th century, kind of the emphasis on feeling, particularly feelings of sympathy, and indeed growing romanticism in kind of the world of literature, art, and culture. So there tends to be this notion that love is becoming more sentimentalized. But as I said earlier, I think that kind of the practice of love, the practical elements of it, the duty, are still quite important, as you can see exemplified in the Clitherow family. And certainly within the religious experience of the two examples I've just given you right now. The emphasis on love within Christian religion, which I noted earlier as being quite important, is not new. So numerous philosophers, one of them is Simon May, have noted that love was identified as the supreme virtue within Christianity, which I noted earlier. This takes on a special significance within the long 19th century, actually. This is another thing I could talk about a bit if anybody has any questions. In the long 19th century, you see kind of discourses of belief shifting when and I would argue kind of love is exemplified predominantly through self-sacrifice and kind of linked with the atonement of Christ for the first 50 years of the 19th century. And then by the latter half of the 19th century, that's shifting. Instead, it still is exemplified through the atonement, but it's becoming challenged, if not somewhat supplanted, by this emphasis on the life of Christ on earth being a great exemplar of love. And the examples of the colonel and the reverend both point to these particular kind of themes, as it were. Now, I've talked about religion and love. I said my second thing in that kind of overview I showed you was about love and community. So the love demonstrated in the two examples I've just discussed, it doesn't just emphasize the religious components of love, but also its social manifestation. Love was often undergirded by religious duty, as members of the Clitherow family aimed to become pious and worthy of emulation. And they weren't alone in this, by the way. This is very common, the desire to live pious lives. And one way of knowing that you are kind of religious, spiritual, truly devoted, was whether others wanted to exemplify you. The success and significance of this love was demonstrated by their impact within the communities, quite frequently, as I've just indicated. Indeed, love was viewed as something which ought to be shared within a community, and these communities had particular rules, rituals, and expectations which influenced the experience of this love. Remember, I said earlier that love is happening within emotional communities, so to speak. And these emotional communities, as one could probably expect, kind of different emotional communities, whether it's a church, whether it's a family, whether it's a kind of a wider community, a country, for instance, there are, as you might expect, various rules, rituals, and understandings about how different emotions and many other things as well ought to be shared and experienced. And this is the case for love as well. Let's look at a couple examples again. So the Reverend William James Tracy Clitherow, coming back to him again. So remember I said he highlighted his physical inability to continue to minister amongst his congregation because he suggested an effective ministry was intrinsically tied to kind of the duties and obligations of ministers. He couldn't effectively love his congregation if he couldn't fulfill all the duties which he believed a minister ought to be fulfilling. So he sent that letter to his parishioners on New Year's Eve, 1888. New Year's Day on 1889, his parishioners wrote back, highlighting their gratefulness for his impact, which they see as linked to the success of his ministry. So his parishioners wrote, and this is an excerpt from what they wrote, "Some of us can look back many years to the time when you first came to the deanery and can call to mind many acts of kind, thoughtful consideration for others, and your readiness to take part in any measure calculated to further the interests of the church in which you have so long and effectively ministered." This is quite interesting. This is sort of a shameless plug here. I just couldn't think of another picture to put on the back of the screen, but this is not unusual. And the Reverend's example here of kind of love being demonstrated through the fulfillment of his duties for the parish, and he resigns, and the parishioners respond by emphasizing how impactful he was, and in effect, how much they love him back. It wasn't always so positive. Successful ministers were determined as kind of successful or unsuccessful. Indeed, indeed, this was measured by the number of attendees, the number of converts, and kind of the measured influence, quite frequently, that they had within a community. And I've looked at this a bit within a Baptist community, as you can see there. And again, this is there are boundaries of expectations and rituals which must be fulfilled, and they must be kind of led by the minister. And if the minister is seen as sort of falling short in various ways, they're at risk of ejection just as much as, or kind of excommunication, just as much as any member from the community. But despite this sort of what one might call a kind of harsh discipline, they certainly didn't believe it was at the time. Despite these kind of disciplinary measures, these measures were still seen as being exemplifying or manifesting love. They were rigid, they were kind of strict in their expectations and in their rituals, because they believed that was a way of sharing love within their community. Now, these rituals and rules could also be found in other communities, of course, as I sort of noted earlier. And you also see that looking at another kind of brief case study within the Clitherow family in the possessions of John Bourchier Stracey Clitherow. Remember, again, the one who inherited Boston Manor household in 1912, and he sold it in 1923 to Brentford. In his possessions in the archives, which are held in the archives, you see this pamphlet on the 1st Battalion of the Welsh Guards, which detailed various offenses and their associated punishments. So, for instance, looking through this, creating a disturbance after lights out could lead to 5 days being confined to the barracks. 7 days confinement to the barracks were issued for those who committed a nuisance in the barrack rooms. So this ostensible rigidity exposed the importance of these fraternal relationships between these men in the barracks and the trenches. So these rules, you might say, were part of a social code within the military family. For some, these were viewed as an extension of family values, as indeed you find some examples, and some historians have highlighted this, that men within kind of the brotherhood, so to speak, in the military, some of them would take on familial roles, acting as kind of mother, father, or indeed kind of brother to their comrades within their battalion and beyond. Rules in which rituals were also sometimes implicit. So Thomas and his mother Alice, so remember Thomas Gurney is the stepson of John Bourchier Stracey Clitherow, whom I just mentioned, and Alice is John Bourchier Stracey Clitherow's wife. So it's her second husband, Alice's second husband. Alice and her son, Thomas, exchanged letters while Thomas was in the trenches in the First World War, and indeed kind of in the war more generally. He wasn't in the trenches the entire time. Thomas often apologized for delays in sending her letters and urged her not to worry. He also frequently remarks on the regularity with which he receives letters from her. On the 1st of June, 1917, for example, after being at war for at least half a year, Thomas writes to his mother, "I found 2 letters here, one from you here. So glad, as I had never had one since leaving." And you can see that's underlined. That's underlined in the letter pictured as well on the right-hand side. Indeed, his punctuation and kind of underlining here, it indicates the significance which he is placing upon this comment, on the receipt of these letters from his mother. This is very common as well, and I can see this in other letters throughout the 19th and early 20th century. You see kind of the exchange of letters and kind of writing to one another in a long distance situation is seen as an important exemplification of love, which maybe some of us can relate to, kind of thinking back to COVID and distance, and maybe think about kind of what rules and rituals did we sort of start to manifest or expect in order to kind of demonstrate and fulfill duties of love over distance. Thomas's letters often indicate he's feeling a sense of homesickness, as he regularly comments upon his desire to go home and see his mother, who at the time appeared to actually live in Brighton. So they owned Boston Manor House, but it was being rented by other tenants, and she seemed to live in Brighton for a time. On the 8th of September, 1917, Thomas nostalgically reflects upon the last time that he saw his family in writing to his mother. He said, "It was a sad moment when I saw you both whisked out of sight once more. It was wonderful of you, both grinding up to see me. I enjoyed it so much. You have both been so heavenly to me." this is another segue potentially, but the underlining of heavenly, I mean, that's in his letter as well, which you can't see on the left-hand side because it's the other side, but heavenly, it's really significant here, actually. And in other research that I have done, I look at the importance of heavenly in relationship to the home. So in other research that I've done, I talk about how the home on earth, the domestic home on earth, is something of a foreshadowing of the heavenly home. So there's a sense in which there's sort of an imperfect experience or understanding of heaven while one is living their earthly life with their domestic family on earth, and that is in some sense a foretaste of what one can expect from the heavenly home. And so I think Thomas's words here are quite significant. I mean, heavenly, firstly, in thinking about how it contrasts with the horrors, the abject horrors he's experiencing in the First World War, but also thinking of heavenly, kind of what is he referring to as heavenly? Well, he's referring to the experience of the domestic home, of being close with his family members, particularly with his mother. So I digress back to Thomas and his mother again. In an undated letter, he also comments nostalgically on another recent visit he had after he had returned to the war front. So he'd gone home and then he returned to the war front. And he said, "You were so tender to me, and I did so appreciate it. I simply loved seeing you both." And the place, once again, both, I think he's referring to his brother here. He said, "My visit was one long happiness." And the emphasis on happiness is also really important here. The kind of understanding of home as being a space of happiness comes up a lot in my research, but this particular kind of happiness of home was usually linked more explicitly, rather than to the space of home, but to the people who are within that home or associated with that home. Kind of like Boston Manor House, I'm talking about the people who are associated with that home and indeed owned the home throughout this entire period. Thomas's desire for home was something that was common in this era. Indeed, in the aftermath of the First World War, there were concerns about the detrimental impact which homesickness might have on future war efforts. There was a working group even set up to try to determine how kind of future psychological issues might be prevented if war were to occur again. I mean, shell shock was developed as a kind of a term and a notional understanding in the First World War. It was used as early as November, December 1914. There have been lots of explanations for this: new weapons technology, kind of the significance of trench warfare. But much of what was identified in kind of investigations after the First World War was the significance of homesickness. And another segue as well, I mentioned masculinity and the significance noted through the Clitherow family earlier. It's also interesting to note that kind of nervous disorders within this period were for the first time kind of prevalently diagnosed to men, rather than seen as kind of primarily a female occupation. But again, I digress. So I'm talking about homesickness and nostalgia, which is quite significant. So Thomas, in his letters to his mother, is frequently indicating that he is experiencing homesickness or nostalgia. Now, that might sound like a strange combination, because the word nostalgia to us in the 21st century, we quite frequently think of nostalgia as being something kind of wistful about the past. But nostalgia actually, in this long 19th century period, and indeed back to when it was first kind of invented in 1688, was related to homesickness. So it was first identified nostalgia in 1688 by Hofer, as you see on the screen, and he coined the term nostalgia, nos meaning home, algia meaning longing for. Nostalgia is a longing for home. And historians and other scholars have often noted that nostalgia seemed particularly to be a pathology of those who were at war. It particularly affected, well, soldiers and sailors, so those who were kind of far away from home or at war. Homesickness there were concerns about it because it tended to inhibit their work. Nostalgia was viewed more negatively rather than a feeling with wistful connotations, as I said earlier. Nostalgia was often viewed as something deleterious as well. In my own research, I talk about kind of this nostalgic homesickness as being something which can, to some degree, be ameliorated through objects, through gifts. So for Thomas and his mother, and I'll talk about this more in just a moment, for Thomas and his mother, the letters that they're exchanging with one another are helping, I argue, to mitigate some of their own nostalgia, the homesickness they feel for one another. And these letters sort of serve as a placeholder until they hopefully can reunite again, either on earth or indeed in heaven in their minds. So, as I said, for Thomas and his mother, these letters serve as a placeholder of absence. Thomas often writes to his mother, and he tries to keep his letters positive. He emphasizes his well-being. So on the 1st of January, 1918, he writes to his mother about a forthcoming period of 15 days. It's the first time he mentions he's going into the trenches, but he almost tries to kind of dilute it a bit. He says, I'm not very long in the front line, so you mustn't fuss about me, darling. So you see, he's trying to sort of construct this notion in his mother's mind that everything is going well in the First World War, as in that he kind of mentally, physically, that he is okay. So this placeholder that she's holding on to as she's missing her son and kind of loving him kind of presents a certain kind of performative conception of experience that Thomas is having. But despite him always trying to stay positive, you do see seeping through this occasionally some of the kind of more harrowing experience in the First World War. So the very next day after the letter that I just mentioned, Thomas wrote a letter to his mother. In this letter, which is pictured on the left-hand side as well, he says that he wishes that the politicians of England might experience the horrors of the trenches themselves. So he's feeling a bit despondent in this letter. And he says to his mother, it's like some hideous nightmare from which there is no awakening ever. During this period as well, Thomas relied quite heavily on his mother's support. He said in 1918, I don't know how I should ever get on without your help. So this homesickness was not so much about the space of home as it was about the people whom were distant and missed. For the members of what I would say is ostensibly a religious family, the hope of reuniting with the family members would be met in the long term, either again on earth or ultimately in heaven. Indeed, the opening of Colonel James Clitherow's funeral, remember I said he died in 1841 and he's pictured here as well, the opening of his funeral emphasizes the anticipation of reunion, of indeed the heavenly reunion, of an ending to homesickness and where one can be with loved ones yet again. The funeral begins by saying that the printed service excerpt says, we may be admitted into those heavenly mansions where those who have fallen asleep in Jesus enjoy perpetual rest and bliss. So for Thomas and his mother, material objects served as reminders of love, placeholders of remembered persons and experiences until reunion. The exchange of these letters was sometimes viewed as significant objects of love, as I've said. And this is common throughout other examples in history that you can see as well. So there's one historian, her name is Sally Holloway, and in her research on love and objects, she talks about how courting couples, so she's talking about a romantic type of love, and she says that couples who were courting in the 18th and early 19th centuries, that they would often keep their letters from one another or kind of little gifts that they gave to one another on their person, and they would kind of stroke these letters or these little objects or kiss them and view them as sort of a substitute, a placeholder for their loved ones. These objects of love could be practical as well. So Thomas often asked his mother to send items from their home to undoubtedly kind of aid him when he in kind of the war front. But these items would have been an intimate reminder of home, the domestic comfort he had left behind and to which he longed to return. So you see an example here. In April 1917, he asked his mother to send him thick, long drawers and long socks. In December 1917, he asked her to send him boots. And you can see here a really cute illustration. He left a detailed illustration of the boots that he wanted his mother to send him and gave her very detailed instructions about where these boots may be found in the home. Objects of love were also noted in the story of Reverend William Stracey Clitherow, whom I noted earlier. So his parishioners actually, among as well as the letter that they wrote to him and the appreciation that they kind of lavished upon him, they also gave him a lovely Chippendale library cabinet that stood at 10.5 feet high and 16 feet long. And a gift was also left for his wife, a silver-handled paper knife and a small writing case, both of these noted as tokens of love and esteem. So the home was owned and sometimes occupied by the Clitherow family from 1670 until 1923. So much of what I've discussed, all of it is focusing on the Clitherow family, focusing in on a few case studies, noting how the emotional community of this family and the wider community of Boston Manor offers insights into the narrative identities people were creating, the stories they were telling themselves, imbued with love, with particular roots in religion and religious duty. So Boston Manor offers insights into this through the religious duties and religious community and its broader community-defined rituals of loving duty and the manifestation of love through nostalgia and material remembrance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for that amazingly full and rich talk. I just want to advertise some of our forthcoming talks. We're well launched on our series on love and death. Tomorrow we have James Wisdom of Gunnersbury Park, and we have talks on Hogarth's House, Fulham Palace, and then a special double act from Kew Palace and Strawberry Hill House.